People who love too deeply experience relationships in a way that goes far beyond the ordinary emotional spectrum. Their love is not just an expression of affection. It is a form of existential immersion. They don't simply connect, they surrender. They invest their emotions with intensity, often believing that true love requires complete dedication. This mindset forms early from childhood lessons that taught them that love must be earned through effort, sacrifice, and proving oneself worthy. When they fall in love, they do not hold back. They love in a way that consumes, that transforms their daily thoughts, and that shapes their decisions. Their emotional world revolves around the person they choose, creating a strong sense of identity tied directly to that relationship. Yet behind this intensity lies a longing for emotional safety, a desire to feel seen, valued, and chosen in a way they may have never experienced before. The deep love these individuals express is not accidental. It is rooted in childhood environments where affection was inconsistent or conditional. Perhaps they grew up with caregivers who expressed love unpredictably, loving one day, distant the next. This inconsistency teaches a child to chase affection, to overperform emotionally, believing that love must be maintained through constant giving. As adults, these individuals replicate the same pattern, believing that if they love intensely enough, no one will leave them. They associate emotional effort with emotional security, even though this belief often leads them into relationships where they give more than they receive. Their intensity is not desperation, it is the emotional strategy they learned to survive in an environment where love was unstable. And although they long for reciprocation, they often choose partners who mirror the emotional inconsistency of their past. People who love too deeply tend to idealize their partners to an extent that blinds them from seeing reality. They elevate the person they love to an emotional pedestal, making them the center of their world. In doing so, they often lose sight of their own needs, boundaries, and desires. They prioritize the other person's happiness above their own, believing that self-sacrifice is a sign of devotion. This idealization creates an imbalance where they give endlessly, hoping the intensity of their affection will create unbreakable loyalty. Yet this very dynamic often leads them to stay in relationships where they are undervalued or taken for granted. Their deep love becomes a shield they use to justify neglect, hurt, and imbalance. They believe that if they hold on tightly enough, the relationship will eventually reflect the love they are pouring into it. Behind every person who loves too deeply is a profound, often unspoken fear of abandonment. This fear lives quietly in their nervous system, influencing their reactions, thoughts, and behaviors. They become hyper-aware of any small sign of emotional distance, a delayed message, a shift in tone, a shorter conversation. These tiny changes can trigger anxiety, causing them to overthink and overcompensate. They may apologize for things they didn't do, over-explain themselves, or become overly affectionate in moments of insecurity. Not because they are dependent, but because emotional abandonment feels like emotional annihilation. Their fear is not just losing the relationship, it is losing the emotional anchor that gives them a sense of stability and worth. This fear makes them cling harder, love more intensely, and stay longer in relationships that do not nurture them. One of the most painful aspects of loving too deeply is the cycle of hope that keeps them emotionally trapped. They believe wholeheartedly in the potential of the relationship, often more than in its reality. They replay good moments repeatedly, using them as justification to endure long periods of emotional neglect or imbalance. This cycle consists of waiting, giving, forgiving, and believing that a change is just one more sacrifice away. They see glimpses of affection from their partner and interpret them as signs of progress. Yet this hope often becomes the most powerful emotional chain, binding them to relationships that do not mirror their level of commitment. Their loyalty is not naivety, it is the desire to validate the emotional investment they have poured in. Letting go feels like admitting that all their love, sacrifices, and effort were not enough. People who love too deeply often find themselves emotionally alone, even when they are in a relationship. They feel the weight of sustaining the emotional connection, the responsibility of nurturing the bond, and the pressure of keeping the relationship alive. They become the emotional backbone, taking on more than their share of effort, hoping their partner will eventually match their intensity. This emotional solitude is one of the most painful feelings. Being physically with someone yet carrying the relationship alone. They suppress their needs to avoid conflict, hide their disappointment to maintain harmony, and mask their sadness behind a desire to be strong enough for two. But silently, they begin to wither. The person who loves too deeply rarely breaks because of a lack of love. They break because they carry the weight of two hearts alone. For these individuals, self-forgetfulness becomes a form of devotion. They believe that loving someone fully requires sacrificing parts of themselves, their time, energy, emotional boundaries, and sometimes even their identity. They adjust their routine to the partner's needs, silence their own discomforts, and convince themselves that their happiness comes from making the other person happy. This pattern is often learned behavior, shaped by a childhood where pleasing others ensured emotional safety. They confuse self-abandonment with loyalty, believing that true love requires giving without limits. But the cost of this emotional erasure is high. They lose their voice, their individuality, and their sense of self-worth. Over time, they may look in the mirror and barely recognize the person they've become, realizing that their love has turned into a quiet form of self-betrayal. When the depth of their love is not reciprocated, these individuals enter intense inner crisis. They question their value, wondering why their effort wasn't enough. They analyze every detail of the relationship, looking for mistakes, believing they could have prevented the emotional distance. This self-blame is deeply ingrained, originating from early experiences where they felt responsible for the emotional instability of adults around them. Not receiving the same level of love feels like a personal failure rather than a reflection of the partner's limitations. They struggle to accept the truth. Love cannot be forced, earned, or proven. The emotional gap becomes a wound that reopens memories of childhood emotional neglect, making the experience of unreciprocated love feel like reliving past abandonment. Healing begins when they realize that loving deeply should not mean loving destructively. The awakening happens slowly, often after months or years of emotional exhaustion. They begin to understand that love, no matter how intense, cannot rescue a relationship that is fundamentally unbalanced. They start seeing patterns, the giving, the chasing, the sacrificing, and recognize that these behaviors come from old emotional wounds, not from genuine romantic connection. This moment of clarity is painful but liberating. It forces them to question their beliefs about love and reevaluate the relationships they choose. They learn that love is not meant to be a constant struggle for validation, but a safe space where affection flows both ways, naturally and consistently. This realization marks the beginning of emotional rebirth. The final stage of transformation occurs when they redirect their deep capacity for love back toward themselves. They begin setting boundaries, expressing their needs, and choosing relationships where they are valued, not drained. They learn that their intensity is not a flaw, but a gift, one that deserves to be met, not exploited. Loving deeply becomes healing rather than self-harm. They start to see that the love they so desperately tried to give others was the love they had always needed for themselves. And in this process, they discover a truth they were never taught. The right person will not require you to lose yourself to be loved. They will meet your depth with depth, your effort with effort, your heart with presence.